the numbers have declined every session. So I'm not sure if I should interpret anything in that. But trust is probably the subject of all of these that I'm most interested in. It's something I'm kind of interested in from a business perspective, but also from an academic perspective as well. So let me jump straight in and talk about trust. I actually want to start somewhere interestingly related to the conversation we just had. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Ukraine, and I don't want to talk about the war itself, which I think we've all get quite a lot on the news, and it's pretty horrific. One of the things you don't see from the news reporting is a lot of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes, and there's a lot of people doing things, and none of this is organized. It's all kind of spontaneous upwelling, and there are bulletin boards you can go on with people asking for help and offering help. And let me just pick a few of them out. These are all very small things, but you know, I looked on the last few days, and they're in multiple languages. And this is somebody in Przemysl, which is on the border, saying, I've got 2 guys arriving from Spain. They'll be driving back to Spain tomorrow. So that's about a 2,000-mile trip each way. They're picking up some refugees. Can somebody put them up for the night? Somebody in Russian, I'm driving a minibus tomorrow to Odessa. Not the safest thing in the world to be doing. I'm picking up people, but I'm got space on the way out. Does anybody want me to take anything? UK, I'm driving to the port. I've got trauma kits. Can anybody put me in touch with a Polish NGO to help me get customs clearance? 2 minibuses from a small village near Saint-Omer in France. We'll be picking up people. We have space to bring more people back. We've got 20 beds in our village. And another one, you know, I'm now living in Germany. I need to improve my English. I'm a Russian and a Ukrainian speaker. Can somebody help me? And there's just hundreds and hundreds of things like this going on, which is, you know, pretty amazing. And you can look at it and you can obviously think of this in terms of goodwill. But I think pertinent to today, the thing that always amazes me about it is the sheer degree of trust in it, in the sense that here's people saying, can you put up 2 people I don't know? Somebody I don't know, can you put up people I don't know, who you've never met before in your life, just for a night, just help them out. And it's fascinating that in a situation which you might think deteriorates trust, a particularly brutal and vicious war, there's a huge amount of trust being shown. And the thing about trust is, you know, we talk about it in professional context, it actually underpins, in a more general sense, everything we do in life, from the absolutely trivial. So we generally trust most people, what they say to us most of the time. You walk into a town you don't know, you ask someone the directions, you don't generally question, should I really trust this person or not? You generally just trust them. Yeah, there's a petrol station around the corner. And it's a fundamental human thing that most of the time we trust people, and it's fundamental to communications. And at a bigger level, obviously when we think about trust, we might think about the time, fortunately not yet for me, if we need open heart surgery and the surgeon is looking down on us benignly and we're sort of thinking, I trust this person or I don't, or, you know, and they're giving us the calm speech and it just makes us calm and we trust them. So trust is a fundamental aspect of our lives. Why is it important specifically to us in our roles? I'm going to look around the table. We've got a particularly experienced group of people here, and, you know, I think we mostly know this, but, you know, trust helps us get our work. And do our work. I think if clients don't trust us, it's extremely unlikely that we're going to get in there in the first place and that we're going to be able to do our work. I think when trust starts to become more interesting is in a couple of other situations, though, is when it gets to the point of repeat business. And we'll all know the situation of the client who we've developed a relationship with. The couple of things tend to happen. One is they'll come back to us, but they tend to come back to us earlier in the process. More often, rather than I've got a piece of work you want you to do here, it starts more often as I'm thinking about something, can you help me shape it out? Or you did a piece of work X, which I know is your really specialist subject, would you consider doing Y or Z? So we get that permission to go on a broader footprint. And the other thing about trust, which I think is the one bit that often gets forgotten, but I think is really important for us, is it dramatically reduces the transaction costs of us doing our work. When a client trusts us, the contracting phase is completely different from when they don't trust us. And, you know, we've all been there with the person who rings us on a Thursday and says, can you start Monday? And yeah, we'll ping emails over the weekend and just agree the terms, but, you know, we'll be fine with that and we'll sort the paperwork out later, versus we have 8 rounds of negotiations and various things and the client summing us up. And to some extent, we're summing up them, whether we want them as well. And the profitability between those two engagements is hugely different if we really costed. And that continues into the engagement in the sense of, you know, we know the people we rock up to and they say, look, if you need any help, just give me a buzz, but otherwise I'm just going to leave you alone to do your work, versus the person who says, can you report to me every day for 15 minutes at the end of the day on progress? This is terribly important to me. And, you know, it may be terribly important, but it also tends to be a reflection of that person doesn't quite trust you, and the overhead on the work is significantly different. So if nothing else in our work, I think it's that transaction cost piece, which is probably, you know, maybe the most important. And we tend to think of trust as a completely natural thing. Actually, it is a natural thing. We're all used to doing it in our normal life, but it can be engineered. And the way we interact with our customers and clients affects quite significantly the way they judge and they assess their trust. Trust is kind of a perception. And I'm sort of interested in all aspects of trust and want to sort of scan across a number of things today. And I want to talk about a few aspects of trust in the section. But, you know, what is most important, and if we don't take anything else away from today, is that what we want in customers is the perception that we are trustworthy. So if customers perceive that we are trustworthy, then we are in a much better position. And so, you know, the final question is, how do customers perceive that we're trustworthy? I'll get to that in a minute, but let me talk about some aspects of trust. You know, trust is an attitude. It's nothing more than that. I've an attitude of whether I trust you or not. Trustworthiness is more of a property. Property is kind of a word philosophers throw around a lot. If you want an idea, as my grandchildren are probably often familiar as shouting, "Grandpa is bald." It's a property I hold. I'm bald. They get great joy out of shouting that regularly and throughout the day, as if I'm the only bald person they've ever seen, and it gives them great pleasure to remind me that I'm bald. Well, I hope I also have the property of being trustworthy, and this is the thing that we want to encourage. And trust itself is what would be described as a three-way relationship. So it's not that I trust you about everything, it's I trust you generally about certain things. And even in very broad trust-based relationships, there tends to be a limit. My wife, I hope, trusts me over lots of things. She doesn't ever trust me to choose the paint or the color of the paint in the rooms. I think that's quite a familiar challenge for men, where we have those debates about that's green, to which I get this most appalled look of, no, that's blue. What do you mean it's green? Or it's gray? How can that possibly be green? And get treated slightly like a sort of idiot of some description. But you know, she trusts me in most things, but not in those. I think the thing about trust, which we're probably conscious of, but I think worth pulling out, is it's intimately tied to risk. So when someone trusts us, every time we're trusted, the other party's actually taking a risk. They're making themselves a little bit vulnerable to us, because they are vulnerable that if that trust, the promise we've probably made them, is not met, then we've breached a trust and we've let them down and we've made them vulnerable. And, you know, this is why breaching trust is a particularly sort of egregious social crime, because of that vulnerability, and breaking a trust is regarded as a bad thing. And if you think about it, it's very different from, say, it's much worse than, say, somebody being unreliable. I don't know about you, I've got kind of two sets of relatives I can basically bundle. I've got some unreliable ones. If I invite them to dinner, I know they'll be an hour or 2 hours late. In fact, I don't even really start cooking until they turn up, because there's no point. And I don't really get too annoyed about it. It's sort of slightly irritating, but I just accept they are unreliable. And ironically, there's another set of relatives who are very, very punctual, and I trust them to be punctual. And when they're not, I actually get seriously pissed off. And in some ways, it can be unfair, because they're the better people, but they've breached a trust. The other people have just been unreliable. And I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic there of trust. And the thing about trust, because we take vulnerability and risk, one of the things we might do is we might take precautions against someone breaching our trust. And actually, the irony of that is that generally just shows you don't trust them. And, you know, the classic is the parent saying, I trust you, but when you're in town, can you keep your phone on? And so I know where you are at all times. And we might smother that up with, because I want to make sure you're safe, but actually it's a little bit of a sign that we don't really trust them, whatever we say. And this is one of the constant gripes of teenagers, will be, you don't really trust me. And quite honestly, they are correct. And perhaps we'd be better saying, no, I don't trust you, rather than pretending that we do and then acting as if we don't, because it's blatantly obvious. So what is trust built on? And I'm particularly interested in the work of an English philosopher, Catherine Hawley, who writes extensively on trust. And she writes, and I think her work really, it's quite extensive, but it comes down to two things which I think really relate to what we do. She basically says we're trustworthy if, when we make a promise, we have the competence to fulfill that promise. And I think to us that kind of relates. We have the competence. We're not stretching our skills too far. You know, we might be saying, I've done 10 SAP implementations, so I can probably manage an Oracle ERP, but we're not saying, I once made one person redundant, therefore I can manage a major company reorganization. You know, we're not stretching our skills too far. We have the competence. And the others that we have, we're not taking on work that we don't have the time or the capacity to do. So we can actually keep to our promises. And there's an interesting point there, I think, for us, which is we will know that there is some clients in our world who are difficult to say no to. The sort of client who, you know, in a rational world would be saying, look, we don't actually have the skills to do that job, or Christ, we're completely fully loaded and we'll say no to. But we all know there are some persistent people who we might actually have a very good relationship with, but they're really hard to say no to. And we can get tempted to say, do you know what, we'll fit it in somehow. And the point that we need to be asking ourselves is it better to disappoint them and slightly irritate them, or is it better to breach the trust by failing to deliver to them? And my view is it's pretty much always better to disappoint them up front than breach the trust. And the danger is also that we might be breaching somebody else's trust by shoving them out, because we've got our client who's difficult to say no to. And that's true not just in work life, that's often true in personal life as well. Those sort of people who, for one reason or another, we find hard to say no to. One point of color that I think it's always worth being aware of is that there's trust comes in two sorts of categories for us. There's that kind of simple trust we have in an expert, which doesn't go very far, but is basically, I trust what you say is correct. Yeah. And then there's the trust that we might have in a friend, or in probably the relationship that we want with our clients, that kind of trusted advisor status, which is, I trust them to act in my interest. And, the classic difference between the two is, I suspect, like most of you, I've got a financial advisor. If I go to him, as, given my age profile is particularly interesting at the moment, how big a pension pot can I have? And he goes 1.070 million pounds. I trust that he's giving me the correct information. But actually, that's a relatively trivial trust. What's more important, that I actually trust him to act in my interest with my money. And that's the sort of trust I think that we, as professional advisors are trying to talk about. So, the basis, we are trustworthy if when we make our promises, we're competent to fulfill them, and we have the ability to fulfill them. That's not desperately profound, but it actually is quite powerful when we think about it. We really sort of reflect on all the promises we make. Have I really got the competence to do this? And have I really got the capacity to do it? It's a very easy thing to assess, but I don't think we always do. Now, back a few steps, I talked about how our behavior determine how much we are trusted. And, trust is this attitude, and we can influence that attitude by how we behave. And, that's obviously related to our competence and capability, but there are other things clients look about because they don't actually know what's going on in our mind. And we can influence how a client trusts us more or less by the way we behave. And that's to some degree, independent of how much they really should trust us. Yeah. Now, I tend to be on the non-cynical side of the world. I tend to be not into manipulating people. I tend to be in the side of, I want to be trustworthy because I deserve to be trustworthy. But nevertheless, we can influence how we are trusted. And I think the most useful insight that I've got for that is provided in, I think, what's now quite an old book. Some of you may well know it. It's a book called The Trusted Advisor by a guy called David Maister. He's got a collection of colleagues who wrote the books with us. And they helpfully give this little equation, the trust equation. Now, it's an American book, which to me generally means the advice is quite good, but you have to get past the sort of slightly excited writing style that this is the most wonderful thing in the world since God made the earth in 7 days. I think it's useful, and they present it as if it's a mathematical equation by pumping numbers in it and putting it up and down. I'm very, very dubious about that myself. Nevertheless, I think the equation is quite insightful and makes us think. And they have this equation, and I probably should have put it on a slide, but I haven't today. And their equation is, I'll read it out, is T equals C plus R plus I over S. Now, T is trust. So trust equals C plus R plus I over S. And, you know, you need fairly basic maths to understand that if that's the equation, you want C plus R plus I to be as high as possible, and you want the S, the bit under the line, to be as small as possible. And let me just talk about what those are. And some of them will be very familiar. The C is our credibility. So does the client judge us as being credible at our work? And if they do, they're more likely to trust us. If they don't, they're less likely to trust us. Pretty obvious. You know, and I talked about in the last talk on competence how people judge how good we are, and it's not necessarily about how good we really are. It's about how our ability to communicate our specialist knowledge. So if we can communicate what we do well, a client is much more likely to trust us. The R is reliability. I said reliability is different from trust. It is, but they are related. You know, and that's a client's judgment on, will we do what we say we do? So, you know, fairly obvious. Client judges that we can do what we say we can, and we're going to do it. That much is pretty straightforward. I think when it gets more interesting is the I and the S bit. So C plus R plus I, and I is intimacy. And this is kind of where I think it gets, I think, quite powerful, because it's stuff that we don't often think about. And intimacy, I think the best description of intimacy that I see is your ability when you're sitting with a client to call out the elephant in the room. And let's give an example of that. We're sitting in a room and a client is going, and Dave may smile at this with one current client we've worked with, and the client's going, you know, it's not quite coming together. And we're sitting there thinking, yeah, the problem is actually you. Yeah, it's you and your behavior. Now, the question is, can you call that out or not? If you can call it out, then you've got an intimate relationship with your client. If you can't, you haven't. And intimacy tends to build from a thing called self-disclosure. So, you know, we all naturally, when we start talking to clients, we start telling them little bits and pieces about ourselves. We might talk about, you know, it starts with trivial stuff. We talk about the weather, we talk about the football scores, what did you watch on telly, and all that stuff. We're trying to build a relationship. But to really build a relationship, we have to do this thing called self-disclosure, which is we have to show something slightly vulnerable about ourselves. And that might be as simple as saying to a client, do you know what? I don't know the answer to that question. That's not my expertise. Or, you know, I find this difficult. And the important thing is we need to go first in the self-disclosure, generally not the client. And when we do that, we tend to build a relationship, a much more intimate relationship, and one where we can call out the elephants in the room. And and I think the reason I focus on that is we're pretty good at the sort of the credibility and the reliability side. We kind of get that. The intimacy side we don't always get. And then the bit under the line is the self-orientation. And this is how much the client judges us to be working in their interest. Have we got their back versus our own interest? And the analogy for this is where this goes wrong is your classic high-end salesperson. And we know we're in a room with a salesperson. They are credible. They are reliable. Actually, they're really good at the intimacy. They've done their NLP training and they're really good at getting us. But something about us, we completely do not think they're working in our interest. We've kind of got them pegged as the only thing you're interested in is your bonus. I know that, and I can tell that by the way you're talking. And therefore, they completely destroy all the other bits by having this kind of very high self-orientation, all their interests in themselves. But if we can get that get that lower, and remember, this is about perception, not necessarily reality. The client perceives that we've got a low self-interest, that we've got our back covered. And actually, I think PIC generally, when I work with PIC, people are pretty good at this. Most of the people I work with are there. You know, our culture and ethos is very much one of think of the client first. I think we're good on that. But so a little useful little tool. I'm not if you read Meister, you'd believe this was rocket science. I don't think it is, but I do think it is actually a very useful tool to think about this credibility, reliability, intimacy, and self-orientation. It gives a little checklist when it's not working about what's not quite going wrong here, right here. Is the client not judging my credibility, or is it I'm not building that relationship, or do they see me as really just after making the sale? Which point of it is? And there you go, trust in 20 minutes, a little bit on trust. Hope that was useful.
Fantastic, thank you, Richard. Any comments, questions for Richard? Experiences?
Or alternative views, very happy to have alternatives.
I'm probably reacting to the intimacy bit because I do find myself wondering most weeks about lockdown. So one of the things that somebody said to me, I've got a feeling it might have been Mark actually, when I first became a delivery director, he said, get in the office. You've got to be in the office. You've got to be next to the client. And it probably took me a couple of years to figure out why, but naturally it's because of intimacy with the client. Those little things, a lot of what we're doing at the moment is transactional conversations to a degree, and you lose a dimension of being able to build some of that intimacy. Certainly with the example that you were thinking about, we're probably in that state. And I do sit here thinking, I kind of like those elements that you went through, but that intimacy one I find quite difficult at the moment, because we have got to find, we're having to find reasons to be in an office as opposed to just turning up, if that makes sense. So I wonder how much that is a factor of, it's a current thing, but a factor of where we are right now and what we've been through, of course, over the last couple of years.
I mean, I've got a view on that, which will probably be the same, which is absolutely, it's much easier when you physically make contact. However, I don't think that it's impossible to build an intimate and a strong relationship remotely. It's just harder. And actually, I do think there's a kind of generational thing here.
Yeah.
And we've grown up in a generation where it's been much more natural for us to. The first thing we'll say is, let's go and have a beer, let's go and have a coffee, whatever it is. And it's been. I watch my son, and it's a completely different level of interaction. And he's grown up in a generation where he meets people, for example, gaming. He's never met them. And yet they seem to, you can listen to the chatter and the banter when they're gaming away. I think it's pretty intimate conversation. So it is possible. It's just, I think it's different. I do also think it is harder. I mean, I think it is easier if you make physical contact with people, and there is still huge value in physical contact.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's generational. I've got one of the clients I can think of at the moment. I've had to have some challenging conversations with him, but he would find it rude if I tried to do it over a video call.
Yep.
It's one, and he'd also probably find it rude if I actually made a formal appointment in his diary for it. He's the sort of person where to get it right, you need to, can we just grab 5 minutes and just,
engineer the 5 minutes.
You've got to engineer it, and it is. And I don't know whether that goes back to your example about the people you trusted to turn up in time and not, but there's something about to be intimate with him, you've got to sort of play by their rules, sort of thing. I don't know whether it's the right words I'm using.
I do think it's a fantastic point though, Mark, because it's actually about them, not about us. Yeah.
I was going to say there's I was picking up on David Mark's comments. There's something of the therapeutic arts in this, because if you ever go and talk to a counsellor, a psychotherapist, the important first step is that step of, and this is a theme I come back to often, Richard, about the actual contracting at the outset. So there's a little bit here where we can be bolder if we dare, and I often say that we hold ourselves back inadvertently. So for me, there's something of instances where people have been intimate with me, or I think I've been intimate with a client. Part of the art is the art of asking permission about the relationship. So when I worked with Phil Goodwin at Morrison's, one of the very first discussions I had with her said, look, to help you, I need to be able to occasionally have conversations that you may consider awkward, but what I'm trying to do is provide, I'm not saying it's a correct view, but I'm stood on high in the crow's nest, scanning forwards, calling out and seeing things and joining dots together. And I want to be able to share that with you. What you then do with it is up to you. And I think the client that you were talking about there, Rich, is a nice example of type where certainly personally I never got to the point where perhaps because I hadn't contracted, where I could have an awkward, what would have been an awkward, different conversation with him. Whether or not he would have taken that, different matter, because again, to your point on trust, some people are just, the current geopolitical landscape, when you stop and look at the narratives on both sides, people will sometimes take a position, and you're not going to reason them out of that. So I think that contracting is important. But I think the other thing, then, having got the contract, is, and I think this is where the S comes in a little bit, is that art of asking questions. So again, counsellors spend a lot of time asking and listening. They're not telling. They're never in tell mode. Your point about salespeople tend to be in tell mode. I'm going to batter you to death. And Dave, when we had the discussion with was it John at Rolls-Royce, I still remember the moment where 7:30 in the evening, we were drowning him in rationality about, and he just said, how much is it going to cost? We gave him a number, he said, I'll buy it. and that felt like, as bludgeoning him. So I think where intimacy starts to come for me is when you can ask thought-provoking questions which make the client realize that you are providing helpful insight for them or awareness without necessarily telling them the answer, but you're opening up. And I certainly agree with you, Richard. That point about slipped my mind, but the other thing I was going to say is the other thing about trust is stock price. So for me, trust is you can build it slowly and the price goes up, but it can drop. You were articulating very clearly about the relatives who turn. You expect them to turn up early and they don't. If you're not careful, it drops. And I think there's also, final point for me would be, when we're working as a team, there's something about individual trust and collective trust. So the duty of each member of the team to be as trustworthy as everybody else, because if you're not careful when you're flying under the flag, you are all tainted. So at the moment, for instance, the worldview of Russia, all Russians are bad people. Well, not all Russians are bad people, but because Russia's fighting a war, well, if you're Russian, you're a bad person. So a lot in that, Richard. Very, very useful.
Actually, just one point. I'm conscious we're out of time,
Yeah.
but one thing for me is sometimes I think people say the words, but what do they actually mean? So if a client says, if you think I'm doing something wrong, tell me, you still need to make a judgment on that client and what he actually
absolutely
can hear. Otherwise, don't take it just as a completely open statement. You have to understand the client to know what do they think.
Yeah, I think that is a very dangerous position when the client actually says that to you. It requires some very careful judgment.
Yeah.
But just sort of come back to my point about contracting, Gordon, that situation, I won't bore you with, because most of you heard the story before, but having established the contract, I would not simply act on that without reminding the client. So in that scenario, I say to the client, do you remember we had the conversation and we agreed that, is it okay if?
Yes.
Now, it's pretty hard for them to say no. They may still react badly to it. But in those situations, I think sometimes it's what's the least bad thing to do? It's the least bad thing to do to stand idly by and let a disaster unfold, or is it to make an intervention which the client may not like?
Yeah. But I like the formula, and it's great, but then there's those nuances to it. And Dave, as you're saying, it's all about the contracting up front and getting that understanding. But I like that. I think that's something I've heard it before and I'd forgotten it, so it's good to come back as a reminder.
I think, looking at the time, we have to round off. I think we can talk for another half an hour if we want to. But Richard, thank you very much. I think it was very informative and useful. And enjoy the rest of your day, and see you again then on the 5th of May.
See you then.
Thanks, Richard. Very good.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.